In the spring of 2022, April Thompson was 26 years old and had a life as orderly as it was simple. A literature teacher at a Portland public school, she used to get up before dawn, make her coffee in a mug with the phrase, "Good things take time," and walk outside into the soft mist that covered the neighborhood streets. She lived alone in a small apartment filled with plants and books, far from her family's excessive luxury. Her students loved her, her colleagues respected her, but in the Thompson circle, April was barely the responsible granddaughter, the one who didn't cause any trouble, the one who didn't shine. While her mother, Linda, organized charity events just to appear in social media, and her brother, Marcus, showed off collector cars on social media, April continued to pay the bills with her salary and tenderly care for her adopted cat, Poe. The day of her grandfather, Robert Thompson's funeral, dawned grey, as if the Oregon sky were also in mourning. In the East family mansion, the scent of lilies mingled with the murmur of hypocritical conversations. Robert had been the founder of Thompson Maritime, a naval empire that began with a single fishing boat and ended up dominating international trade routes. Everyone knew the will would be read that afternoon, and everyone hoped to emerge a little richer. April arrived alone, wearing a simple black dress with her hair tied back, avoiding the flashbulbs and fake hugs. She sat silently in the back row, reminiscing about afternoons of chess with her grandfather, never imagining that on that day, in front of her entire family, the world would make her feel more invisible than ever. The reading of the will began in the grand hall upstairs, where an imposing portrait of the patriarch dominated the scene. The family lawyer, Mr. Morrison, a man with a deep voice and ceremonious manner, began reading the names of the heirs with the solemnity of someone handing out wreaths. The atmosphere smelled of expensive perfume and restrained ambition. April's mother, Linda, received a villa in Tuscany, her brother Marcus, a luxury yacht anchored in Monaco, cousin Jennifer, a chain of boutiques in New York. The smiles multiplied like fireworks in a dark sky, until the lawyer paused, looked at his papers with discreet discomfort, and said, without looking up, "To my granddaughter, April Thompson, I leave this envelope." The silence thickened. A moment later, a nervous laugh escaped Jennifer's lips. Linda raised an eyebrow, murmuring disdainfully, "Perhaps it's a farewell letter, or a spiritual blessing." Marcus added with a crooked smile, "Or monopoly money." The laughter echoed through the crystals of the chandelier. April looked down, containing the humiliation that was rising like fire in her chest. She took the envelope with trembling hands, murmured a mechanical thank you, and left the room before the tears betrayed her. In the elevator, with the echo of the laughter still pounding. In her memory, she broke the seal on the envelope. Inside was a first-class ticket to Monaco and a note written in her grandfather's unmistakable handwriting. "Trust activated on your 26th birthday, sweetheart. Time to claim what's always been yours." April stood still in the elevator, her heart beating so hard she could hear her own pulse. Next to the bill was a small bank statement printed on Swiss paper with gold seals and numbers that seemed unreal. $347,000. She rubbed her eyes, convinced it was a cruel joke or a clerical error, but on the back, the document bore the name of a private bank in Zurich and a signature she immediately recognized, that of Prince Alexander of Monaco. For a few seconds, the elevator seemed to stand still in time. April, the woman her family treated like a shadow, held between her fingers a truth no one else knew. That same night, in her apartment, she searched online for the Swiss bank's number. She dialed with cold hands and a trembling. A voice, wondering if anyone would answer. A secretary with a European accent connected her directly to the prince's office, who spoke with aristocratic calm. "Miss Thompson," he said, "your grandfather trusted you more than you can imagine. The fund was activated on schedule. We'll wait for you in Monaco to discuss the details." The phone slowly fell from her hand. In the silence of the room, April realized that the world she knew had ended. The envelope, ridiculed by everyone, contained no taunt. It was the door to a hidden legacy that her grandfather had kept just for her. 2 days later, April boarded the flight to Monaco, her mind racing. She stared out the plane window as the clouds swirled with light and shadow, wondering what kind of secret her grandfather had kept for so long. She landed at Nice airport and was greeted by a driver holding a sign with her name on it. The drive to the Principality wound through cliffs, gentle curves, and the blue glow of the Mediterranean. Arriving in front of the palace where Prince Alexander was waiting, April felt out of place in her modest coat and rolling suitcase. However, the butler greeted her with a bow that seemed to recognize something in her that she herself had never known: authority. Prince Alexander was a man in his 50s, with a serene gaze and a measured voice, the kind of person who speaks little but leaves a deep impression. He welcomed her into a room adorned with antique portraits and leather-bound books. "Your grandfather and I shared a friendship based on absolute trust," he explained as he poured tea. "He knew that in your family power could easily corrupt. That's why he chose to hide his true legacy until you were ready." Then he spread a file bearing diplomatic seals on the table. Inside were the documents of the Thompson International Trust, with holding companies spread across Monaco, London, Las Vegas, and Tokyo. April felt a sudden vertigo. The life she had known, the classroom, the books, the routine, was transforming before her eyes into something she could never have dreamed of. Alexander also showed her a series of accounting records detailing how, for years, she had discreetly received the trust's earnings. That teacher's salary, which barely covered the rent and books, was merely a symbolic fraction of her own profits. Her grandfather had planned everything so that she would never suspect, so that she would learn the value of work without the shadow of privilege. He said that those who don't know how to work won't know how to protect wealth, the prince commented with a knowing smile. April remained silent, staring at her grandfather's signature stamped on each page. It was as if he was still speaking to her, teaching her one last lesson from the other side of time. That night, from the balcony of her ocean view suite, April allowed herself to cry. Not from sadness, but from a mixture of love and wonder. She remembered the afternoons when her grandfather would challenge her to chess and tell her that pawns can also be crowned if they have patience. Now she understood the metaphor. He had silently groomed her, teaching her strategy, observation, and temperance. The murmur of the waves hitting the rocks surrounded her like a song of farewell and rebirth. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel small. She felt like an heir, not to money, but to purpose. The next day, Alexander took her to the fund's main building in Monte Carlo, where dozens of employees were waiting to meet her. Some greeted her with respect, others with genuine admiration, as if they had been waiting for this moment for years. In the boardroom, a screen projected the names of the companies under their control: hotels in Las Vegas, casinos in Singapore, properties in London, resorts in Sydney. April couldn't believe what she was seeing. "All this is yours," Alexander said in a firm but gentle tone. "Your grandfather didn't just leave you an inheritance. He left you a structure that can sustain or destroy generations." The young professor felt the weight of power for the first time, a weight that wasn't crushing, but that demanded poise and character. In the days that followed, April toured the businesses, observing every detail with the precision she had learned in the classroom. At the Monte Carlo Bay Resort and Casino, The manager treated her with formal courtesy, but he seemed nervous. It wasn't every day that one met the new owner of an empire. In Las Vegas, she walked the halls of the Belmont Grand Casino and Resort and recognized her grandfather's philosophy in every decision. "Luxury is not in gold, but in fair dealing," he had once said. Each place told a story, and each reflected the mind of a man who had thought long-term, leaving an invisible map that only she could decipher. The more she learned about her grandfather's legacy, the more she understood that the true legacy wasn't in the numbers, but in the vision behind them. April began jotting everything down in a blue-covered notebook, as if she were taking notes for a class that never existed. She wrote about ethics, about leadership, about how money can be a weapon or a bridge. Sometimes Alexander watched her from a distance, admiring her serenity. "You don't seek power," he told her one afternoon. "You seek purpose, and that sets you apart from all the other Thompsons." She smiled shyly, knowing that those words, though coming from a prince, resonated as if they were her grandfather's voice speaking again. Yet while April was transforming in Monaco, the family in Portland was beginning to grow restless. Her mother called insistently, demanding an explanation for her sudden disappearance and asking if she had found any interesting work. Marcus sent mocking messages, implying that she was on vacation funded by Grandpa's spirit. April ignored them, determined not to reveal anything yet. She wanted to fully understand the scope of what she was dealing with before confronting them. Deep down, she wasn't seeking revenge, but quiet justice. She wanted to show them that love and intelligence were worth more than inherited arrogance. And she knew the best way to do that was silently, letting time speak for herself. The following months were a whirlwind of discoveries. April hired financial advisors, reviewed contracts, and trained in international law. Her discipline surprised even the most veteran executives. Sometimes she spent entire nights in the trust's office, reviewing balance sheets with the same concentration with which she had once graded exams. What motivated her most wasn't the money, but the feeling of fulfilling a purpose her grandfather had patiently outlined. Something inside her was maturing. She was no longer the shy young woman who feared her mother's gaze. She was the heir to a moral mission, the chess piece that finally understood its move. One morning, while drinking coffee across from the Monte Carlo harbor, April flipped through a newspaper and found a story about the family company in Portland. The article mentioned that Thompson Maritime was experiencing serious financial difficulties. Her father, David, had lost contracts with international ship owners, and debts were mounting. April put her cup on the table and sighed. She understood that life offered her an opportunity, not for revenge, but for balance. She could help, but without revealing her identity yet. And so was born the idea that would change the family's history, to create a parallel company, a discreet front under which she could reach out without showing her face. That same week, April gathered her trusted team and registered a new company under the name Neptune International Holdings. The name was no coincidence. Neptune, the god of the sea, represented the silent power that governs the tides, just as she planned to do with her family's destiny. Through the company, she began acquiring scattered shares of Thompson Maritime and studying the corporation's weaknesses. No one in Portland imagined that this young professor, who always seemed so distant from the business world, was weaving a master move on the chessboard. Each signature, each transfer, was a chess move made calmly and precisely, like the ones her grandfather used to celebrate with a smile and a phrase. Never announce checkmate, let them discover it. Over the next few months, April traveled secretly to the United States under the pretext of academic visits. In reality, she met with intermediaries, analyzed balance sheets, and discreetly negotiated with her father's creditors. Soon, the purchase offer was made, $45 million for the family company. It was too tempting a sum for a desperate businessman. David accepted without suspecting anything, convinced that he had achieved a dignified exit from his crisis. The transaction was closed in a matter of days, and in that instant, April became the sole owner of the empire that her grandfather had founded and that her father had let falter. The circle, at last, was beginning to close. On the day the contract was signed, April walked through the offices of Thompson Maritime with an almost solemn calm. No one suspected that the young woman silently pacing the halls was the new owner. She looked at the portraits of her grandfather on the walls and felt a mixture of pride and melancholy. She had achieved the impossible without raising her voice, without boasting or scandal. When the lawyer handed her the final copy of the acquisition, she simply filed it away in a folder and said, "Now everything comes back home." That moment wasn't one of euphoria, but of gratitude. It wasn't about possession, but about restoring the balance that her family's arrogance had shattered. A short time later, she returned to Monaco to inform Alexander of everything that had happened. The prince received her in his office with a serene expression, as if he had anticipated this outcome. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said. "Not only did you take back what was his, but you did it with elegance and justice." April smiled, but her eyes held something more than satisfaction. She had learned that power doesn't shout, it is wielded in silence. She decided she would return to Portland soon, not to humiliate anyone, but to look her family in the eye and, for the first time, speak her truth. The board was set for the final move. When April returned to Portland, autumn had painted the streets shades of red and gold. No one in the family suspected the magnitude of what was about to happen. Linda organized a reconciliation dinner at the family mansion, convinced that her daughter had finally accepted her role as a quiet supporter. Marcus arrived late, as always, sporting a new watch and telling stories no one asked to hear. April sat opposite them, calm, letting them talk, uninterrupted. The topic inevitably turned to family business, and her father sighed wearily. "At least I sold the company before it went under," he said, trying to sound philosophical. She looked at him tenderly, still not responding. After dessert, when the atmosphere had calmed down, April took a black leather folder out of her bag and placed it on the table. "I want you to read this," she said, her voice so firm that silence fell over the room. David looked at her strangely. Linda frowned, and Marcus rolled his eyes. Inside the folder were the purchase documents, the signatures, the seals, the transfers. "The company you sold belongs to me," she announced without drama, as if stating an inevitable fact. Her mother gasped, her father remained silent, and her brother muttered an insult under his breath. April calmly added, "I'm not looking for revenge. I just want you to know who I really am." The silence that followed was so heavy that the ticking of the antique dining room clock could be heard. Linda was the first to react, a cross between disbelief and fury. "What kind of joke is this, April?" she asked, abruptly standing up, but her voice trembled. David reviewed the documents with trembling hands, checking the stamps, the signatures, the account numbers. Everything was legitimate. How did you do this?" he stammered. April wasn't smiling. There was no arrogance in her expression. "With patience," she replied. "With the same patience Grandpa taught me when we played chess. Every move takes its time." Marcus gave a bitter laugh, muttering something about the sheep that turned into a wolf. No one spoke again for a long time. Finally, April broke the silence. I don't want your money or your approval. I just want respect. And for you to understand that love isn't measured by inheritance." Her words resonated with a calmness that hurt more than a scream. Linda slumped in her chair. David lowered his head, and Marcus avoided her gaze. It was then that April realized she hadn't just won a company, but her emotional freedom. She stood, picked up the folder and said softly, "If you ever want to start over, I'm willing. But only if this time you speak the truth." Then she strode out of the mansion with a firm stride, without looking back. Outside, the autumn wind enveloped her like silent applause. That night, April drove to the hill where she had bought her new mansion, a modern house with large windows that overlooked the entire city. From there, she could see her parents' old mansion, illuminated in the distance like a memory that no longer hurt. She lit the fireplace, poured herself a glass of wine, and reviewed the trust's latest financial reports. Everything was in order. For the first time in years, she breathed without guilt or fear. She had closed the cycle of humiliation with intelligence and dignity. She leaned back on the sofa and looked at the dancing fire, thinking of her grandfather and how every conversation, every chess game had prepared her for this moment. And if you're watching this until now, tell us where you're standing with us. Perhaps like April, you too have once felt that life underestimated you. But you're still here, watching how everything changes. The following days were peaceful. April attended meetings, made important decisions, and began to feel the maturity of power well wielded. However, she didn't let vanity or the temptation of exhibitionism get the better of her. She knew her strength lay in discretion. The local press began to speculate about a mysterious foreign investor who had rescued the shipping company. No one imagined that this figure was the same woman who months earlier had been ignored during the reading of a will. April smiled as she read the headlines, not out of pride, but because she finally understood her grandfather's final lesson. True respect isn't imposed, it's inspired. As the weeks passed, April slowly began to rebuild family ties. She didn't do it out of obligation, but out of conviction. She invited her father to a formal lunch at the company headquarters, where he would now work as CEO. When David arrived, nervous and resigned, April greeted him with a firm handshake. "Grandpa always believed in you," she told him. "But you needed to remember what it felt like to earn your place." He didn't respond. He just nodded, his eyes moist. In that instant, beyond hierarchies, they recognized each other for the first time as equals, two heirs to the same love and the same lessons. Over time, Linda also reached out, albeit more timidly. She posted an apology on social media, acknowledging that she had misjudged her daughter and that true elegance is not in what is inherited, but in what is built. Marcus and Jennifer followed her example, perhaps motivated by public pressure, but the gesture was enough. April didn't humiliate or reject them. She embraced them with the serenity of someone who no longer holds a grudge. She knew that family wounds are not healed with money, but with humility. That process of forgiveness strengthened her more than any number in a bank account, because it gave her back something that power could never buy: inner peace. A year later, April had become one of the most influential women in Portland. Not only did she control an international conglomerate, but she was also renowned for her ethics and generosity. She founded the Robert Thompson Foundation for Educational Excellence, with an initial fund of $100 million earmarked for scholarships for underprivileged youth. Every time she handed out a new grant, she recalled her own days as a teacher, when a simple donated pencil could change a student's motivation. "Education is more transformative than money," she would often say in speeches. and everyone knew she wasn't saying it out of protocol, but because she had experienced it firsthand. Her philanthropic work began to gain international attention. Magazines, conferences, and leadership forums constantly invited her. But April chose her appearances carefully. She didn't want to be a celebrity, but rather a silent role model. In a television interview, she was asked what had motivated her to dedicate so much to education. She replied with a faint smile, "My grandfather taught me that knowledge is the only legacy that no one can take away." That phrase went viral in a matter of hours, becoming an inspirational quote for thousands of young people. Silently, April knew she had kept her promise. To honor the memory of the man who taught her to move the pieces without losing her soul. Over the months, the mansion on the hill became her refuge. April spent her afternoons in the garden, reading or listening to jazz, while the wind stirred the linen curtains. Sometimes she looked toward the horizon and thought about everything she had been through, the teasing, the envelope, the trip, the revelation. Each memory hurt and healed at the same time. On the quietest nights, she would stay awake, watching the city lights, and murmur a phrase her grandfather used to repeat, "Power is only valid when it serves goodness." That idea had become her compass. She was no longer afraid of losing everything because she knew that what was essential was within her. One morning, while reviewing reports in her office, she received a handwritten letter from Switzerland. It was from Prince Alexander. In it, he told her he had decided to retire from business to dedicate himself to teaching and cultural diplomacy. At the end of the message, he wrote, "Your grandfather saw in you something the rest of the world had yet to understand. Balance. Maintain that, and you will lack nothing." April kept the letter in a glass frame on her desk. It reminded her that true connections are not measured in money, but in mutual respect. She smiled, knowing that her history with Monaco had come full circle. Just as the ocean returns to the harbour everything that once departs. That year, April decided to sail for the first time on her own yacht, which she named Legacy. It wasn't a symbol of luxury, but of gratitude. She had it built in honour of her grandfather, following the original plans of the first fishing boat with which he had started his fortune. On the main deck, she installed a small library with books on history, philosophy, and navigation. There she would sit and write reflections on life and power, as if conversing with Robert through time. Each sunrise on the high seas was a reminder that her story wasn't about money, but about identity. The invisible granddaughter had learned to see herself with her own eyes. One afternoon, as the sun set over the horizon, April welcomed a group of fellows from her foundation aboard the Legacy. The young people were amazed, not by the ship's luxury, but by the simplicity with which she welcomed them. She spoke to them about effort, patience, and how success is not measured by applause, but by the serenity of being able to sleep in peace. One of the students asked her if she had ever wanted revenge on those who underestimated her. April smiled and replied, "Revenge is a fire that burns everyone. I preferred to be water." That phrase provoked a respectful silence. In that instant, they understood that they were in the presence of someone who had gained much more than power. That night, when the young people said their goodbyes, April stood alone on the deck, watching the sea reflect the lights of the coast. The salty air tousled her hair, and the rhythmic sound of the waves reminded her of her childhood, when her grandfather would take her to the port to watch the ships depart. She felt a lump in her throat, not of sadness, but of fulfillment. She silently expressed gratitude for everything she had experienced, even the humiliations, because they had been the raw material of her strength. She had learned that well-understood wounds can be transformed into compasses, guiding her toward a more authentic life. As the months passed, April began writing a book titled The Value of the Invisible. It wasn't intended to be a bestseller, but rather an open letter to those who had once been underestimated. In its pages, she honestly recounted her grandfather's lessons, her family's moral decline, and her own awakening. The manuscript became a kind of collective mirror. Each reader found a part of themselves in it. When the publisher published it, they received thousands of messages of gratitude from people who had decided to reconcile with their past. April then understood that her story was no longer hers alone. It belonged to the world. A year later, The Value of the Invisible was presented at a literary fair in Lisbon. April walked calmly onto the stage, dressed in a simple white linen ensemble. As the audience applauded her, she thought not of the headlines or the numbers, but of her grandfather's face looking down on her from somewhere beyond time. "None of this belongs entirely to me," she said at the beginning of her speech. "I am only the thread that unites the wisdom of those who came before me with the dreams of those who will come after me." Her words resonated in the audience with a moving calm. Even the journalists stopped typing to listen. It was the voice of someone who had won the most difficult battle, that of being true to herself. That same night, she walked alone through the cobblestone streets of the historic center, book in hand, the Atlantic breeze caressing her face. She stopped in front of a bookstore where her work occupied the main display case, illuminated by a yellowish lamp. At that moment, she thought that perhaps the greatest legacy wasn't the trust or the fortune or even the recovered company, but the ability to transform humiliation into inspiration. "If my story can help someone not give up, then it was all worth it," she murmured. Then, without seeking recognition or cameras, she disappeared into the streets, taking with her a serenity that money could never have bought. Back in Portland, routine became her ally again. April returned to her passion for teaching, although this time she did so as the director of educational programs at her foundation. She was fascinated by seeing how young people who previously lacked opportunities were now creating sustainable, community-based projects. Each story of success she learned became a reminder of the purpose that guided her life. In her office, she hung a plaque with a phrase engraved in metal: "Respect is not inherited, it is earned with every act of consistency." It was her daily mantra, a moral compass that reminded her of who she was and where she came from. One rainy afternoon, April visited her grandfather's grave for the first time since the funeral. She carried a bouquet of white lilies, the same ones that had perfumed that day of farewell. She knelt before the headstone and remained silent for several minutes. "Everything went well, Grandpa," she finally said, her voice breaking. "I not only got back what was yours, but what I am." The wind stirred the leaves of the trees, as if old Robert were answering her from somewhere unseen. April smiled, letting a single tear mingle with the rain. In that moment, she understood that the greatest inheritance was not material but spiritual, the wisdom of not getting lost along the way. The following years cemented her legacy. April was no longer seen as the mysterious heiress, but as an ethical leader who had transformed a family empire into a force for good. Her story inspired documentaries, conferences, and investigative articles, although she rarely gave interviews. She preferred to let her actions speak for themselves. In one of her most memorable speeches, before an audience of young entrepreneurs, she said, "Money reveals who you are. It doesn't change you. It only amplifies your essence." That phrase was etched in the collective memory of everyone present, and many considered it the purest definition of what it means to wield power with purpose. Despite her success, April maintained the simplicity that had always distinguished her. She continued to cook for herself, grow herbs in the garden, and read every night before bed. Sometimes, when silence filled the house, she heard in her mind's eye her grandfather's laughter and his eternal advice. Never forget to play with patience, even when everyone is looking at the king. Life, she understood, was not a game to be won, but a constantly moving board. And now, she moved the pieces with the serenity of someone who doesn't seek to prove anything, because she's already proven everything. One summer afternoon, while reviewing new educational projects, April received an unexpected visit from Marcus. He had a different air, more humble, without the arrogant glow that had once accompanied him. He sat opposite her in silence, and after a few seconds murmured, "I wanted to thank you for not destroying us when you could have." April looked at him tenderly. "Family isn't destroyed. It's rebuilt," he replied, pouring her a cup of tea. They talked for hours, reminiscing about their childhood, summers at the coast, and Grandpa Robert's jokes. When Marcus left, April understood that his gesture was the clearest proof that forgiveness, when born of respect, can heal even the most broken bonds. That night, the sky above Portland was clear, filled with stars. April stepped out onto the balcony with a blanket over her shoulders and a cup of hot chocolate. From there, she looked out at the sleeping city and felt a deep calm, as if the universe were silently returning everything it had once taken from her. Inside, there was no resentment or pride left, only gratitude. She had understood that true justice is not meted out through punishment, but through example. And in that instant, amid the distant lights and the warm summer air, she thought that perhaps her grandfather was looking down at her, smiling from somewhere where time no longer existed. At dawn, April woke up with a feeling of lightness. She walked barefoot down the hallway of her house to the large window overlooking the garden. The sun filtered through the trees, painting every corner gold. She took out her notebook and wrote, "Life isn't always fair, but it always offers a second chance." She closed the notebook with a smile and headed to her study, where a mural displayed photos of the first generations of graduating fellows. It was her way of reminding herself that real change doesn't happen in the headlines, but in the quiet lives that blossom thanks to an opportunity. If this story touched you in any way, please leave a like, comment from where you're viewing, and share it with someone who needs reminding that self-respect is worth more than any inheritance. The sun rose slowly over Portland, reflecting in the windows of her house, as if the universe were confirming her purpose. April poured herself a coffee and watched the steam rise, imagining that each cloud of scent carried a fragment of her story, the envelope, the journey, the silence, the forgiveness. She had reached the end of her journey not as a conquering queen, but as a free woman. At the dock, her yacht, Legacy, waited motionless, gleaming in the light of the new day. She smiled and whispered, "Thank you, Grandpa." Then she stepped out into the harbor, ready to set sail for the horizon, certain that sometimes the most powerful endings make no sound, only peace. The harbor was quiet, barely awakening to the sound of seagulls and the smell of salt. April boarded the Legacy and took a deep breath of the fresh dawn air. Around her, the sea stretched out like an infinity mirror, and for a moment, she felt like everything in her life had been a long journey to get to this point, the calm after the storm. There were no cameras, no family, no witnesses, just her, the boat, and the fulfilled promise. She started the engine slowly and let the yacht glide out to sea. The waves seemed to whisper her name, silently celebrating the woman who had learned to master not the sea, but herself. As she sailed, April opened a small wooden box she kept in her cabin. Inside was a letter Prince Alexander had given her on his last visit. When you feel the world go silent, remember that this is a sign you found your rhythm. She read it once more, smiled, and carefully put it away. She approached the bow, let the wind play with her hair, and closed her eyes. She thought of all she had lost and gained, and realized that the deepest victory was having transformed pain into purpose. The sea, like an old friend, seemed to nod, accompanying her toward a new dawn. Hours later, the Legacy stopped in the middle of the ocean, where the water was so blue it seemed bottomless. April stared at the horizon, her bare feet on the deck, the sun caressing her face. She took a white rose from a small basket and slowly dropped it into the sea. "For you, Grandpa," she whispered. The flower floated for a few seconds before disappearing into the waves, and that simple gesture summed up everything: love, forgiveness, gratitude, and freedom. Inside her, there was no trace of resentment or pride, only a luminous certainty. Everything that had happened had a purpose. She had closed the cycle with love, not revenge. As the yacht headed back to the harbor, April felt a peace she'd never known before. She looked up at the sky and smiled, convinced that Robert Thompson was watching her from somewhere where good hearts meet. The invisible granddaughter was no more. In her place, a complete woman had emerged, aware of her worth and her history. As the wind played through her hair, she thought that money could buy boats, houses, and businesses, but never the serenity of a soul who has made peace with her past. So, sailing toward the coast, April realized that her greatest inheritance was not gold or power, but the wisdom to love in silence and shine without making a sound.